My name is Mike Balkwell. I'm the campaign director with the Wellington Water Watchers. And recently we've become involved with Michelle and Bill and the fine leadership group in the municipality of South Bruce, near the town of Teeswater, that is fighting the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's plans to put what they call a deep geological repository, which is fancy talk for a nuclear dump. Their intention is to dig a big, deep hole in the ground and over time bury up to 5 million spent nuclear fuel bundles. Now, this is an outrage. It's also a David or Davida and Goliath fight. And the Wellington Water Watchers is providing support to protect our waterways, and we're very pleased and honored to be able to do that. I'm going to ask Michelle to turn on her screen as I finish my introduction. There's Michelle and Bill. Wave to the audience, folks. Michelle and Bill, give us a little wave, yeah. And from their transformational campaign headquarters in Teeswater, Ontario. And Michelle, I think, is going to lead us through a PowerPoint presentation. Am I right? And then we're going to
start with a slideshow.
And then we're going to have some Q&A. And then when are we going to do the video from Emily? A little time after that?
I'm not sure. Were they able to get a hold of Emily's video? I have Emily's. She was going to join us live, but she couldn't get connected. So I'm going to read her report.
All right. Okay. So Michelle, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to get off the screen, and I'll come back after your presentation to facilitate a Q&A. And people in the audience, please, as Bill and Michelle are presenting, feel free to put your questions in the chat box, and then we'll come to them after the presentation. Take it away, Michelle and Bill.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Can everybody see that? Did that work?
Thanks.
Protect Our Waterways, No Nuclear Waste is a group of concerned citizens who joined together in February after a surprise announcement that 1,300 acres of prime farmland had been purchased and optioned by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. The NWMO is a federal agency, not a federal agency, but rather a not-for-profit organization established in 2002 by Canada's nuclear energy producers. The board of directors and the advisory board are all individuals part of the nuclear industry. The NWMO's mandate is to find a place to bury the nuclear industry's problem. They do this by targeting economically depressed communities looking for ways to grow their economy. They offer funds to these communities to learn more about the project. From 22 communities, we are now down to 2 possible site selections, South Bruce and Ignace, with the final selection expected by 2023. In South Bruce, this funding over the years has amounted to $2.7 million, and this has been divided into 2 categories. Part of this is used to fund things like playground updates, town hall repairs, and donations to local groups. The remainder of the funds are to promote the project within the community. This includes wages and funds to create a community liaison committee to present both sides of the story. Up until now, all presentations and speakers have been pro-DGR, and there's been no information on any risks. Recently, 2 more municipal staff members have been hired to educate and communicate, along with another $1.7 million to evaluate the project. South Bruce Council states that no decision has been made regarding this project, but their actions indicate that they feel the DGR would be the solution for economic growth. There has been no commitment to include a community vote in the final decision about this nuclear dump. As concerned citizens, we've learned enough. A deep geological repository is an unproven experiment that puts our water at risk. History shows that burying nuclear waste underground does not work. In Germany, 2 separate underground projects have failed. They are now trying to clean up the radioactive mess at considerable time and expense. In New Mexico, there's the Waste Isolation Pilot Project, which is the only true deep geological repository, and it is for low and intermediate waste. This one was often referenced as an example of how a DGR would be successful until a series of accidents in February 2014. One of these included a radiation release above ground. That accident was the result of human error. It took 3 years and $500 million to clean up. The WIPP facility is in the middle of the desert, with the closest town being 35 kilometers away. The WIPP Land Withdrawal Act 1911 states that the 1,500-acre underground footprint is part of a 10,240-acre controlled area to serve as a safety zone. South Bruce is prime agricultural land right next to a town, under and beside a river, and the local residents are being told they can live on top. The World Nuclear Waste Report 2019 very clearly states no country in the world has a deep geological repository for spent nuclear fuel in operation. This report also warns that not enough is known or understood about the risks of nuclear waste. It also states that many scientists favor long-term monitored storage in a protected environment is preferable, and that research and science is not adequate for the challenge. According to Dr. Gordon Edwards, president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, the NWMO and the OPG do not anticipate any scenario in which this waste will leak. But no one anticipated the accidents at 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, or Fukushima. Accidents are usually not foreseen. Until they happen, they seem unimaginable. History tells us you can't predict human error. They used the wrong kitty litter in the WIPP drum and it exploded. You can't predict unexpected results. Boeing added a feature to their aircraft intended to prevent planes from stalling, but instead resulted in 2 terrible plane crashes. And you cannot predict unintended consequences. At the time, the chemist who invented DDT and received a Nobel Peace Prize for that, nobody anticipated the devastating effects it would later have. Man cannot guarantee a container that will last for 1 million years. From the NWMO technical report, containers for the disposal of used fuel are typically designed for a very long life. When the containers eventually fail by corrosion as a result of groundwater ingress into the repository, waste constituents can migrate out of the disposal facility and enter the biosphere. That biosphere is part of the Great Lakes Basin. Studies out of Sweden are warning copper corrosion can happen much quicker. Their next stage of licensing approval has actually been postponed as they await further test results. Sweden's plan has 5 centimeters of copper coating. Canada has 3 millimeters. Studies are being raised over concerns of how radioactive uranium combined with ceramics reacts with various forms of metal. The newly formed glass or ceramic compounds in the steel containers have been observed corroding much quicker. This is a study from the Ohio State University, and they describe this as severe. There's just too many unanswered questions. A man-made container filled with radioactive waste, stored underground in a repository that will eventually be saturated with groundwater, a nuclear dump in sedimentary rock near the body of fresh water that provides drinking water to 40 million people is unprecedented. Is this an experiment worth trying? What happens if the water's contaminated? That was actually the question that started my journey to learn more about the project. We asked, what happens if this project affects my water? I can't use bottled water for my livestock. If my sheep don't get enough water, I don't get milk. We were told that that was a really good question. They were glad we had shared the reasons behind our water concerns, but they weren't at the point of answering that yet. We need to protect the Teeswater River, which flows through the site. The repackaging plant with the processed water settling pond, the 60-acre excavated rock pile, all pose potential surface runoff contamination risks to the nearby river. Due to the massive amount of excavation associated with this project, will our water table in the immediate areas be lowered and consequently reduce the water supply in our drilled wells? The rivers and the Great Lakes cannot be placed at risk for this experiment. Currently, Canada has 5 shipments of high-level waste per year. Once the DGR would become operational, there would be 1 to 2 shipments per day. What are the radiation levels that travel with these shipments? The transportation risks of radiation are expected to be below safe levels. The radiation as part of the repackaging plant is expected to be below safe levels. Any radiation that leaks from the DGR is supposed to be safe levels. How many safe levels can you be exposed to before it becomes unsafe? This past September, the International Atomic Energy Agency put together a report for the Canadian nuclear industry. They recommended that the government should enhance the policy and strategy for radioactive waste management, and that the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission should align its radiation protection requirements with the international safety standards. This is not the time to be making these decisions. Who pays to clean up the problem in case of an incident? There's no coverage available for a nuclear incident or accident. People in Japan were evacuated after the Fukushima incident were forced to move back to their homes before they felt it was safe, because their rent subsidies were stopped. The government increased the level of what was considered safe for radiation exposure so they could tell the people to move back home. Japan also raises concerns within the farming community regarding products produced near a nuclear dump. Chapman's Ice Cream has already raised this concern, as a large portion of their cream is sourced through local dairy farms and the Teeswater Gailey plant. Purchasers of our products have choices, and the stigma associated with the proximity of a nuclear dump may affect those choices. In Japan, they're still trying to convince consumers to purchase their food, even though they do extensive testing to prove its safety. Some were told that their products would not be a part of the Tokyo Summer Olympics because of this perception. The site chosen by the NWMO is prime farmland that is used to produce food. Why risk land that produces valuable food for human consumption? Why would we bury radioactive waste under this site, potentially impacting the quality, safety, and production of these products? What is the solution? At this time, we're told by OPG and the NWMO that the waste is safe where it is. Dr. Julie Brown from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission stated at the CLC meeting on August 6, 2020, "It is safe right now on the surface. It just requires a lot of human effort and making sure records are kept." Teresa McClellan of the Canadian Environmental Law Association says, "A better option than locking in a decision now is to fortify the temporary storage for a few more decades. Wait for new and better technologies. As long as we use nuclear energy to produce electricity, they will continue to produce nuclear waste on the shorelines where it will need to be cooled before it can be moved. So what problems are they actually solving? Burying it deep underground and eventually walking away, hoping that the earth will take care of it, does not solve the problem for future generations. Why should you be concerned? As humans, we have basic needs that include food and safe water. Why would we jeopardize an area rich in these commodities by burying radioactive waste that is dangerous for hundreds of thousands of years? Why take the risk? Although they claim safety and protecting the environment is their #1 concern, how did the NWMO end up with a possible site in South Bruce? They ended up here because council put up their hand to learn more, and because a handful of landowners agreed to sell them land. Is the safest location really one with a river that ultimately ends up in Lake Huron, has multiple swamps, seasonal flooding, large aquifers, artesian wells, prime farmland, and is next to a small town? If safety is the #1 concern, why are they using an elevator shaft instead of the safer ramp model to get the nuclear waste into the repository? Why is our copper only 3 millimeters when other countries are all looking at 5 centimeters, and studies are questioning if even that will be thick enough? We have collected almost 1,600 signatures within South Bruce against this proposed DGR. Last election, the mayor received 1,381 votes. We've presented this petition to our council. We've held several parades, protests, and events. We've created an awareness in the community through letters to the editor, newspaper ads, and signs. There are over 600 signs on display. We have sent out over 50,000 information flyers to surrounding communities. We have an online petition that is over 15,000 signatures. and we have just started gathering signatures from across Ontario for a petition that will be presented to the Ontario legislature later this fall. We are being completely ignored by the NWMO, and they tell us to learn more. How can you help? We need your support. The NWMO has billions of dollars and 25 employees dedicated to promoting this project to the people in South Bruce. We are a grassroots organization that is the only group sharing the risks involved in this project. We do not have unlimited funds or people power. We need your help. You can sign the online petition, sign the Ontario petition, collect signatures, help spread awareness about this proposed project and the risks involved. People need to know. Send letters to the editors and also to politicians. Thank you very much. I think we're back.
Thank you, Michelle. Now, folks, you can enter a question in the session chat box. And Michelle, if you stop sharing your screen, or did you want to leave that up there for people to see? Maybe we should leave that up there. Okay. So, Bill, I'm just wondering, is there anything that you want to add while we're waiting to see if there's comments or questions?
No, but this is a terrible fight. I listened to the presentation earlier today about the need for water for our future generations. The comments we get from the NWMO all the time is that since we've enjoyed the electricity all the years of our life, it's our responsibility to deal with it and bury it in the ground. They don't concern themselves that future generations will need water and food as the essential things of life. We don't need nuclear waste buried in the ground. And that's where I come from primarily.
Bill, you know, one of the things that's been interesting to me, hearing you folks talk about what's going on up there, first of all, the NWMO, as you said, is an organization that's funded by the nuclear industry, and its nonprofit status may confuse the public and make them think it's a, you know, a government organization. It's not. It's the organization of the nuclear industry. And one of the things that has struck me is how they're actually trying to shame you into taking this, accepting this DGR. So say a little bit more about this argument that they have, that because you use electricity, quote unquote, you should be happy to have this nuclear dump in your backyard. Why do they say that?
Well, the mandate of the NWMO is to find a location to bury the waste. Without that getting done, then they don't have a job at the end of the day. So they use these tactics. They call us fear-mongering, you know, any other thing that would say we providing misinformation. The issue we have with both our council and the NWMO is all the information that's been provided so far is information that's generated within the NWMO. And if you're in an organization like the NWMO, you've got a mandate to be successful in placing this stuff in the ground, you're going to use your best foot forward. You're not going to tell everybody about what the issues might be associated with such a project. You're only going to tell them the benefits. And that's what we've heard ongoing, is all about the benefits, and then trying to force us into accepting this as our responsibility. It's not our responsibility. Our responsibility as people in this area is to protect the water and protect the food generation ability of this area. We are really in very prime agricultural community. Farming here is very good. It's one of the better areas of all of Ontario for farming, for producing crops like corn, soybeans, and the like. And they're all essential to the ongoing future generations. We need to protect it. They'll tell us that we have misinformation about the water. you know, that we're not scientists. What do you people really know? You're just farmers. And that's basically what we bring.
So Bill and Michelle, we're starting to get some questions in the chat box. So this is a question from Rob Case. Are there other communities fighting the same issue in Ontario? Is there any kind of network of activists or communities?
There are other communities, particularly up north is Revlon Lake, which is part of the Ignace community. They're the other site that the NWMO is considering for burying this nuclear waste. It's highly radioactive material, as you know. It can kill you if you stand next door to it certain times. But that's the other community. There are other communities that we're now trying to join together with, like SOS in the Georgian Bay area, and also the Envy Huron groups. So we are trying to form a coalition that would fight the NWMO. We know this is a very uphill battle. The council in South Bruce, we're a community that's losing population. Also, we are not very economically sound, so we don't have a lot of economic growth going on. So the council views this as a salvation to that need of solving the economic problem for the community. And so they're very much in tune with what the NWMO is trying to do. And certainly it'll bring a lot of people to this area and a short-term economic growth, but at the risk of really jeopardizing some very important commodities of our life.
And people probably may know that there had been a proposal by Ontario Power Generation to have an underground site for low to intermediate nuclear waste that was planned for the Kincardine area. And the Kincardine Council had agreed to this, but the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation voted against it, and that they had been promised that they had a veto over this, and they exercised their veto. So that was stopped. And the SOS group that you refer to was a leading group in fighting that proposal in that community, and they're joining with you to stop this as well. It's practically in the same neighborhood. I noticed in the chat box that Janet Graham says that in Ottawa they're fighting a planned nuclear waste dump at the Chalk River. And Janet, I'm going to ask, if you don't mind, to just put a little more information in the chat box about that. And if there's a link to any organization or campaign around that you can share with people. And Alyssa McClurg has a couple of questions, and here's the first one. What stage are they at in the review cycle? So there's a process, kind of a review process going on here, Bill and Michelle. What stage is the NWMO at?
NWMO would say they're in a 9-step program altogether. They would consider themselves in step 4. Step 4 is where you do borehole drilling to determine whether the soil is good for burying this nuclear waste. They also, at this point, try to educate, so they say, although they've been trying to educate us now since 2002, and I assume we're very slow learners. But that's the kind of stage they're in. So they're at the stage of getting ready to do some real testing of the environment, as well as the borehole drilling, which will test the soil acceptability to having a DGR built in this community.
And Bill and Michelle, I want to draw out for our audience's attention the whole issue about consent by the municipality. So the NWMO says all along that you have to be a willing host. But as I understand from what you've told me, they are deliberately vague about what indicates what constitutes being a willing host. And so this relates.
Good question.
This relates to Alyssa's question about where are you at in the stage. So talk to us about the whole issue of being a willing host and what you think needs to happen in order to demonstrate whether the community is or is not a willing host.
The NWMO would say you'd have to be a compelling, willing host community. When you ask them, well, what's the definition of a compelling, willing host community? They say, well, we're not sure. Then if you ask them, well, how will that, what's the mechanism that will determine whether you're a compelling, willing host community? They will tell you that could be done in a number of ways. It can be done by a telephone poll, maybe a survey, what they did in Kincardine, which is really totally one-sided in favor of going ahead with the DGR, or you could have a vote or a referendum. Our approach at the moment is asking our council to make sure, and asking the NWMO to make sure that we have the opportunity for the residents of South Spruce to have a say in this matter, whether or not we want to become a compelling, willing host community. So we have requested that now. When we presented the petition back in June, we've requested that again in August of our council. We're requesting that of NWMO multiple times. We are told that we're too early in the process, that we need to get informed. We need to study more so that we know that the community is informed. But the bottom line is we have no commitment to having a referendum. We know that the survey approach or the telephone approach that OPG deployed in Kincardine is just not acceptable to determine whether or not a community is a compelling, willing host. When I had discussions with the NWMO about what does compelling mean, I indicated to him that, to Ben, our favorite guy, the vice president of the site selection here for NWMO, that you should have at least 66 2/3 of the people that are agreeing that such a proposal should take place in this community. No commitment again. It's always, well, we'll get back to you on that, is kind of the standard answer we get, not only from the NWMO, but the same answer from our council.
So part of the problem here is that the NWMO is dictating the terms of what they think indicates community or public acceptance. And the community really needs to do that. And it sounds like the council is not on your side, that the council is cooperating or colluding or collaborating with the NWMO. So John Jackson asks the question, can you speak to the commitment? Can you speak to the commitment of the community acceptance by the public, not just the municipality? At this stage of the game, what do you think is the community's level of support or opposition for this?
Well, as we indicated in the presentation, we have 1,600 people that have signed a paper petition. The community is a community of 5,600 people in total. Out of that, there's around 4,100 voting people, eligible voters. So we have a fair chunk of the people. We did this back in February and March prior to COVID-19 restrictions. So we've covered about half of the community at this point in time, from a point of view of being able to visit them. We went door to door to get these signatures and to talk to people about it. Up until now, up until February, there's been very little dialogue with the residents of the community. Although the CLC committee was formed back in 2012, and it's supposed to be a committee that is representing the residents of the community, less than 100 people attended those particular sessions, and they're held monthly. So in a given year, you'd find less than 100 people that attended. So they just haven't been able to connect with the community at all, and they're certainly trying now as because of our effort, we've awoken the community up to this issue. But certainly at the moment, if you stick with the 66 2/3 people that need to approve such a project, we would have more than enough to defeat this project with the signatures we currently have.
I'm looking at a question from Sharon Collingwood, and Sharon, I think, lives in Perth County. And she says, have any studies been done to show the possible threat to areas farther off from the dump site?
No, that I know of. No studies have been done by NWMO. They have concentrated primarily in South Bruce at this point, or Reverend Lake up in Ignace. They have not, as far as I know, expanded beyond the geographical territories of the two chosen sites.
Now, earlier you explained to us what rolling stewardship is, and that rolling stewardship is a method of managing radioactive nuclear waste where you maintain it in a monitored and retrievable state at all times with continual improvements to packaging and environmental protection. And one of the disadvantages of the many disadvantages to a DGR is that the waste gets buried and it's covered up forever and essentially abandoned at some point. But Sheila asked this question: how would rolling stewardship protect the lake when the fuel would be on the lake shore, repackaged indefinitely on the lake shore, exposed to climate change and human error? Isn't that a bigger risk to the lake and water? What do you say to that?
Well, there are several answers to that. So first of all, the misconception is that we're going to get rid of the storage above ground at these nuclear facilities. That's not true. The fact is, when the material comes out of the reactor, it has to be stored in ponds for up to 7 to 10 years, so cool it down. Then it moves into what is currently now the dry storage area for another 10 to 15 years. So for 30 years, you got to store this stuff above ground. And the reason you have to do that is that the heat that's being generated by the radioactive material is just too hot to put into a DGR. It'll fracture the rock and cause more leakage of water into the facility itself. So what we're not asking for this to be stored above ground forever. It's been stored above ground for 50 years. The NWMO and OPG would say it's been safe. There's not been any issues, so they claim. So we'll accept that. So we're asking them to keep it above ground for another couple of decades, and for a couple of reasons. One, we really believe that there should be some additional research done on hardening the containers itself. So there's studies going on about using glass instead of metal and cement as a storage for the nuclear fuel. And also the fact is we want additional studies going on that are looking at neutralizing the radioactive component and reducing it from millions of years down to 300 years or less, which is also a very good thing. There are some studies going on that said you could reuse this fuel. After all, there's only about 5% of the fuel that's used in the reactor itself. So you still have 95% of usable capability in that fuel, and there are programs going on that would suggest that there are reactors in design that would be able to reuse the fuel and get more energy out of it. So that's kind of where we are. Nothing changes relative to the need to store it in the shores of Lake Huron forever. As long as you have nuclear generation, you'll have storage above ground.
And Sheila has added an additional comment, to clarify her earlier question, which is, she says, I mean, after the reactors are non-operational, this storage only makes sense, I think you mean above ground storage, only makes sense while the reactors operate. So what's your...
Right. Well, we have a program going on at Bruce Power right now to keep those reactors going for another 40 to 60 years. That's a major production going on. So there's a long time before we ever think, and whether some people think that nuclear generation should never go away. So her question is interesting, but actually not factual.
There's a comment from Janet Graham, which I think that will be interesting to you, Bill. The Council of Canadian, Michelle, the Council of Canadians in the Ottawa chapter is currently joining other groups fighting Chalk River project plan to create massive above ground nuclear dump. It's not far from the marsh that leads to the majestic Ottawa River, and approximately 140 municipalities on the Quebec side have come out against it. So we seem to have very similar problems. And I think that hints, I think Alyssa was asking earlier about a larger coalition, and I think that there's some overlap here. And we also know that in the opposition to the OPG proposal for a DGR for a low to intermediate waste in Kincardine, which was defeated, was opposed by a international coalition. A similar number of 120 or 130 mayors signed a joint letter calling on the federal government to cancel that proposal. So there's a lot of allies out there for us to link with. Elisa McClurg asked, which newspapers are the best for us to write to for a letter to the editor? And I'm going to let you answer that question in a second, Bill and Michelle, but Alyssa, you and others could write into the chat box, what is the closest newspaper to you? So Bill and Michelle, if people were to write a letter, does it matter which newspaper they write to?
Actually, the more newspapers that get written to, the better, because as more people find out about this project, I think that's part of why they've gotten as far as they've been able to get in this process, because people just didn't know about it. I mean, we actually live like the farm next door, and until it was announced in the newspapers in January, we really didn't know much about this project, and I'm not the only one who was surprised by the announcement. And still now, you talk to people in local towns and they are surprised to hear about this proposal.
We have a list of newspapers that we would be happy to post them somewhere, Mike,
yep.
or send them to
yep.
whoever needs them.
And Elisa, I see you.
We also have a list put together.
Go ahead, Michelle.
With all the politicians' emails and address. We also have a list of politicians and our council members and local politicians that can be sent
and Elisa,
letters.
I see you with the Waterloo, your local paper's the Waterloo Record, and that would be an important place to write a letter to the editor. And I would encourage anybody who's on this call today to later tonight or tomorrow or Monday morning for you to say, I was part of this workshop. I heard for the first time, or I heard about the Protect Our Waterways, and I heard about the proposal for the DGR, and I opposed that. And to write a letter to the editor, to your local paper, as a consequence of listening to this workshop would be a terrific help. I'm going to ask Michelle one more question, and then we're out of time, and we're going to switch over for the closing ceremony. And I'm going to try and set you up here, Michelle, so you can do the short version. But on their website, there's a very funny film they've created as a parody to highlight the issue of the responsibility. So the NWMO and some local people who are involved in the nuclear industry have said, well, you use electricity, you have a responsibility to store the waste. And Michelle has a very funny example involving manure that I think would bring the point home for all of us. So Michelle, I'm going to ask you to give us a short version of that story as our closeout for this workshop.
Like the story, or just
how you use it as an example? Yes.
Well, basically, I turn around and we ask people, did you enjoy your steak today? Did you enjoy your eggs? Because using the nuclear industry's method of thinking, that means I can take a load out of my manure pile and come dump it in your backyard because that's the waste that was produced from my product. And I also sometimes think, like, you know, somebody goes to watch a Blue Jays game and they buy one hot dog or one drink. Do we expect them to take all of the garbage home from that day? We don't. Like, there's no other industry that has been given permission to take their waste problem and make it the consumer's problem.
It's a good story, Michelle. Bill and Michelle, I want to thank you. You're leading a very, very important fight. You're leading that fight on behalf of your community, but you're leading it on behalf of all of us. And we're here for you. We are in solidarity with you. We're going to be working with other communities to support you in your fight. Thank you for being with us today and to bring this information to the attention of more people. Thank you to everybody in the audience who was here. I'm kind of stalling for a minute here. If there's a last comment you want to put in the chat box to send your good wishes to Bill and Michelle, do that. We'll be following up with all of you. Recordings of all the workshops will be available. We are going to create some reference materials and some how to take action after all of this. Thank you all for being here.